Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
Another lecture about vowels now. And I think the first thing I've got to talk about is the question of vowel notation. One of the things people have often complained about over the years is that different scholars, different authorities don't all use the same notation system, phonetic notation system for English vowels. Historically speaking, we can see that there have been various tendencies. In the days when people used typewriters and had very few special symbols available, there was pressure to use a system that required few symbols. And so, for many, many years, until about 1975, 1980, the predominant system in EFL circles, at any rate, was the one that you see here, where we use a small number of symbols and distinguish between pairs of vowels like E and I, of read and rid, by using length marks. If you look on the handout, you see the words read and rid. You find this in Daniel Jones's Outline of English Phonetics and in his English Pronouncing Dictionary, editions 1 to 12. But at the same time, certainly from the 1930s onwards, there was another system in use, particularly among those who were teaching phonetics to native speakers of English. I'm thinking of speech therapists and actors and so on, where we use more symbol shapes and we distinguish between E and I, similar pairs, not by the use or non-use of length marks, but by having a different letter shape. And this is what we call the qualitative notation. In the quantitative one, you see, we place emphasis upon the length, the quantity, but in the quality one, we place emphasis upon the quality difference. And this requires quite a few extra symbols in order to count it. This was used by Ladefoged, for example, in the early editions of his course in phonetics, by Abercrombie and other writers in the Edinburgh School of Phonetics, and by Ida Ward, for example, in London. Well, both of these were in rivalry, shall we say. When I was first appointed to the staff of the department, I had to operate both systems depending on which class I was teaching, so I had to be flexible. Anyhow, then Gimson, really, the head of the department, came out with a new book, Gimson's Introduction to the Pronunciation of English, still widely used, now in a much later edition than then. And he launched this compromise system, which is both quantitative and qualitative, because it both uses length marks and uses different letter shapes. So that the distinction between E and I, read and rid, is shown twice, both by the presence or absence of length marks and by the choice of an appropriate symbol. And in this way he wanted to reconcile these two traditions. And I think he can be said to have succeeded, because this system has essentially been adopted by almost all serious writers on English phonetics, including Peter Roche, including me. And Ladefoged, in fact, in recent editions of his course, has also adopted it. This has also enabled us to make special use of the compromise symbols for the happy vowel and the thank you vowel, that I talked about the other day, by having the ordinary letter I or U without the length marks. It's thereby distinct from the E that we have to distinguish in places where the contrast is made. Okay, now, one of the problems that people often feel about this current system, any quantitative system, is that when we have a word like teacher, there seems to be a problem. What's your job? Oh, I'm a teacher. Now, if we call this a long vowel, as we do, people say, well, why don't you say teacher? Because we don't. And speakers of Finnish, for example, who have paired long and short vowels, feel that surely they ought to use their long vowel, which would indeed produce a pronunciation of the sound teacher. But we don't say teacher, we say teacher. So now we have to explore why this arises and what the problem is. Well, the problem is that we have a process in English which affects the duration of vowels in particular contexts. We call it pre-fortis clipping. Pre-fortis because it applies when the vowel is followed by a fortis consonant, that is, a voiceless consonant. One of the voiceless obstruents that we identified last week. When you have a following fortis consonant, then the duration of the vowel is shorter, is reduced. And you can hear this quite noticeably if we compare pairs like we see on the screen. Right and ride, safe and save, niece and knees. Notice I'm using the same intonation pattern, so they're exactly comparable, and I'm sure you can hear the difference in duration. My brother's daughter is my niece, my niece. These are my knees, my knees. So it lasts for a shorter time when it's followed by the voiceless fortis S than when it's followed by the voiced lenis Z. Batch, badge. We even get this with short vowels. You can hear a difference in duration. Batch, badge. And in diphthongs. Rope, robe, rope, robe. So everything else being equal, the effect of a following fortis consonant is to reduce the duration of the vowel. Now, there's a terminological problem. We don't really want to call this shortening because it's too well established, the distinction between long and short vowels, which is read versus rid. We don't want to call it, therefore, shortening because it doesn't result in a short vowel. What you get is a long vowel but clipped, that is, reduced in duration but with its quality unaffected. So, as it says on the handout, a clipped vowel is one that is pronounced more quickly than an unclipped vowel. Okay, more examples then. A cart, a card. Open vowels like R have a rather greater duration anyhow than close vowels like E, and the effect is not so great, but it's still there. Cart, card. Back, bag. Rich, ridge. Not so noticeable, again with short vowels, but it is still there. And this is, of course, one of the main ways in which we signal the distinction between fortis and lenis consonants. We signal the consonant difference largely through the duration of the preceding vowel. So on the one hand we have piece, pieces. On the other hand we have peas and easy. And you can hear the difference in duration. Piece, pieces, peas, easy. Or again, tape, paper with pre-fortis clipping, pay, labour, without it. Tent, enter, with it. Send, sender, without it. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that I believe that in a word like enter, the T is in the first syllable. Now, not many people seem to share this belief, but if we want to account for the allophones used in English, the shortened allophone before T, then it seems to be helpful to say the T is in the same syllable. If the T is clearly in a different syllable, as when the time is 10 to 3, then you don't get pre-fortis clipping. But in words like enter or centre, you do. Built, shelter, with pre-fortis clipping. Build, elder, without it. However, there's also another clipping rule in English. Very complicated, this, because it interacts with pre-fortis clipping. And this is what we call rhythmic clipping. And this is a consequence of the tendency in English for stressed syllables to recur at equal intervals. English has a tendency towards isochrony. Now, it's not an iron rule, it's not metronomic, we don't have to do it absolutely exactly, but it is a tendency. And this means that if we have a word like man, and compare it with a word like manage, and compare both of them with a word like management, there is a tendency for each of those words to occupy the same amount of time, because they have to fit into the same rhythmic slot. I'll go and ask the man, do you think you can manage? It's a matter for management. Likewise, if we compare read, reader, readership. Now what we have in these cases is increasing numbers of unstressed syllables, weak syllables, which have to be slotted in to the same stressed slot. And therefore, because we've got more material to fit in, we have to squash everything up. We have to make the a long in man, because it's got a whole word to occupy, single syllable. Not so long in manage, because there's an inch to come, and not nearly so long in management, because there's all of idiomt to fit in as well. Man, manage, management. Would you like to try and say those with me? Man, manage, management. Once more. Man, manage, management. So this is why a word like man can often seem to have really a rather long a, against the rule that this is a short vowel. Read, reader, readership. Try it. Read, reader, readership. Okay, so that's rhythmic clipping. Now you can see why teacher is a particularly interesting case, because it has both kinds of clipping in the same word. The E is pre-fortis clipped because it's got a following ch. Teacher, 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 and it's got rhythmic clipping because of the unstressed syllable, the that follows teacher, teacher, teacher. So the E there is subject to both kinds of clipping. The resultant E is fairly short in duration in terms of milliseconds, but it still counts as one of the variants, one of the allophones of the E phoneme, the E vowel of English, because it's the kind of E that we use in this particular position, compared with long E that we have in a word like tree, where these special factors don't apply. And there are many other words in English, of course, where equally we get this combination of pre-fortis clipping and rhythmic clipping. The diphthong, the first syllable of basis, is a good example. Basis, basis, basis. Not basis, but basis. Basis, because of the S, the voiceless S. Now, when people write a dissertation, alternatively known as a thesis, this word gives problems for the same reason. It's not a thesis, but it's a thesis. 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 Thesis, like teacher. Baker. decisive. On the handout, we've got the example usefulness, which is a further case in point. Right, I want to move on now to the question of functional load of vowel contrasts, vowel oppositions. We have a very large number of vowels in English compared with many other languages. And so you might feel in principle there are a large number of contrasts that you and your pupils must master. Well, that's true in one sense. But it's also important to emphasize that some contrasts are much more important than others, and therefore much more deserving of classroom time. And one such contrast is that between E and I. There's a bit out of a pronunciation practice book. Some of you may be familiar with it. Sheep and ship. And it's minimal pairs. Pairs of words where the only difference is the vowel contrast, the vowel opposition between E and I. So from the top down we've got sheep, ship, bean, bin, eat, ate, seat, sit, leak, lick, cheeks and chicks. Well, we say this opposition has a high functional load. First of all because there are plenty of pairs like this, and secondly because it really can make a difference to the meaning of a sentence which of the two you use, and lead to misunderstandings or confusions if you choose the wrong one. Be careful not to sleep. Be careful not to slip. Whereas there are other pairs in English for which we can't make the same claim. So, I mean, exactly parallel, the oo contrast, oo short and long, you might think this is just as important as E and I, but really it isn't. There are very, very few pairs of words distinct by this difference. So we do have look and Luke, the man's name Luke. We do have pull, tug, and pool, small lake. We do have full, not empty, and fool. We do have, well, non-rhyming pairs like foot and boot or foot and shoot. But really, you can get by without this contrast. First of all, in the north of England, there are many people, and in Ireland, who rather than look at something, use the pronunciation to look at something. So that doesn't cause us to misunderstand them. In London and elsewhere, there are people who confuse up and do before L. This is where they localize the L, and they end up saying Paul for both of them, or fool for both of them. Doesn't prevent us understanding what we're talking about. Worst of all, you might feel, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, nobody at all makes this distinction. Scottish people all say foot and boot as perfect rhymes, look and look as perfect homophones. It doesn't cause the sky to fall in. So, really, this is a contrast that it's hardly worth bothering about, unless you really want to pass yourself off as English or American. To sound native like English or American, you've got to master it. If you should choose to wish to sound like a Scot or somebody from Northern Ireland, then you could neglect it. Anyhow, the opposition has a very low functional load. So let's concentrate on the oppositions that have a high functional load, because unfortunately they're not the same as the ones that give no problems. E and I we've already looked at. Similarly, N and A. Easy for some, very difficult for others. Difficult for German speakers, difficult for Polish, Russian, Hungarian speakers, difficult for Koreans. Lots and lots of contrasts. A pet and a pat. So the pet is the animal, the pat is the action of touching it. Singular and plural, one man, many men. a net and a gnat. Somewhat out of proportion in the picture. Pedaling and paddling. These pictures, by the way, come from a very nice book some of you may know by Trim and Nebo, English Pronunciation Illustrated. I show it you also out of homage to John Trim, who was my first teacher of phonetics, and he provided the words, and Nebo was the artist who drew the pictures in this book. Another important contrast, or and or, not so important. This is a sort of intermediate one. Dawn and dawn. Two different names. Cod and cord, or cot and court. Pot and port. Cocks and forks. Spots and sports. Now I've noticed that these words fall into two groups. The or words on the right. Some of them, most of them in fact, have an R in the spelling, and are therefore words where Americans and other rhotic speakers will pronounce an R. Cord, port, forks, sports, and so on. But two of them don't have an R, dawn and court. Well, for people like me, it's the same or in all of them. Court and port rhyme perfectly, because I don't have an R or any kind of a trace of an R in these words. The Americans who don't have the R anyhow in these words also often don't have the vowel contrast. So although there are some Americans who distinguish between a man's name Dan and a woman's name Dawn, between cat that you sleep on and caught from catch, there are many, many other Americans for whom there's no such distinction, and Dawn is ambiguous, cat is ambiguous. So for those of you who have an American English orientation, really this is not an opposition to worry about. For those of you who have an English orientation, I think it is. Right, let's move on now to a more dynamic matter. I want to talk about something that happens to vowels in connected speech and sometimes to vowels in words in isolation. And this concerns the number of syllables in a word. We have quite a large number of words in English where it's difficult to be certain of the number of syllables. Words like lenient. And the problem is, does lenient consist of 3 syllables, or does it consist of 2 syllables? And I think the answer to this question is that you can say it either way. You can say it as 3 syllables, lenient, tum-ti-tum, lenient, or you can say it as 2 syllables, lenient, lenient, and it doesn't matter. Influence can be 3 syllables, but we can also say it as influence, 2 syllables. How many syllables in the ing form of verbs that end in a syllabic consonant? We can say threatening, and to threaten. Threaten plus ing gives threatening. But we can also say threatening, threatening. Do we say he was threatening me, or he was threatening me? Well, I know I go for the second one usually, he was threatening me. But it doesn't matter, and there are people who prefer threatening me. Was I whistling, or was I whistling? Well, both. Uncompressed whistling, compressed whistling. Which did you prefer? That is, which was your preference or your preference? How many syllables? Is it 3 syllables? Preference or preference? Or is it 2 syllables? Preference. Well, certainly both are possible. So what I would claim is that we have a dynamic process of compression in English, which as speakers we have a certain choice about. In many cases we can choose whether or not to compress the word, that is to lose one of the syllables. And I would claim that generally speaking we tend not to compress the first time we use a word in a discourse, if it's an unfamiliar word at any rate. We tend not to compress in slow or deliberate speech, deliberate speech, but once it becomes less deliberate, then we're more likely to compress. So we compress more in fast speech, in casual speech, with words we've used before, in very familiar words. Now, we have talked a bit about syllabic consonants last week. And of course, a syllabic consonant is what we have in the base threaten or whistle. And so I regard the syllabic consonants as derived by rule, as you see here. Schwa n gives you syllabic n, threaten gives you threaten, whistle gives you whistle, and in a word like preference, can give you in American English, father gives you father. And so I would say that the input to the compression rule in English can be of two types. Either it's the happy vowel or its equivalent, the thank you vowel, or it's a syllabic consonant. And as these lose their syllabicity in the process of compression, the happy vowel turns into a semivowel, lenient becomes lenient, and the thank you vowel turns into a W. Influence becomes influence. The syllabic consonants just turn into the equivalent non-syllabic consonant. Consonant, 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 consonant. There's another example. I'm doing it all the time. And I don't know if you're noticing which choice I'm exercising. I started saying consonant because I was speaking very slowly and carefully and deliberately. But once I get going, I'm going to say consonant less deliberately. Now, what are the circumstances under which we can do compression? We've seen what the input is, but does this mean that every possible such sequence could be compressed? Certainly not. We can get some idea of what's involved by comparing certain pairs of words which happen to have the same spelling but different pronunciation. And these are the verbs and adjectives or nouns or whatever that end in ATE spelling. We have a verb to separate things. We also have an adjective, separate. Notice the difference in the treatment of the suffix. The verb has ate, the adjective has, well, either it in old-fashioned speech or ut more recently. Both are perfectly okay. Now, what is interesting is that the adjective can undergo compression, but the verb can't. So we always have to say to separate things. We can never say to separate them. But we can do things separately, or have separate items. So we can compress the adjective, separate, and the derived adverb separately, but we can't compress the verb to separate. Similarly, we have a verb to moderate. This discussion forum is moderated. Got to keep the schwa there, moderate. But we also have an adjective, moderate, and that can very readily become moderate. And similarly, moderately can become moderately. Moderately good. So what's going on here? The clue clearly is the nature of the vowel in the syllable that follows. the place where you might get compression. And the rule seems to be you can compress before a weak vowel, but not before a strong vowel. So this builds on the distinction we made last week between strong vowels and weak vowels. Compression, in order to know whether you can do it or not, you have to know whether the following vowel is strong or weak. If it's weak, you can compress. In every case here we have weak vowels, uns, uns, ing, uns, all weak vowels. That's where you can compress. Now, before we pursue this matter further, I must just raise one further question because somebody asked me about it. Asking about the ear we have in words like lenient and many other such words, serious and so on, period. The question is this the same centering diphthong ear that we have in words like near? Well, it's transcribed by some authors in the same way. Not by me, because I use my happy vowel plus a schwa in this case. Am I right? Well, it's certainly true that it can sound identical to the ear of near, lenient. Well, very difficult to hear the difference. As a speaker, I don't actually feel them to be identical. I feel I know in each case which one it is. But as a serious phonetician, I have to admit that listening tests were carried out by a researcher who found that people couldn't reliably hear them apart. What he did, by the way, was to take the word windier, the comparative of windy, a windy day, windy weather, this weather is windier than that weather was, and then he considered words such as reindeer, the northern animal, has antlers, reindeer, Santa's sleigh is pulled by, and he said, well, there's another kind of deer called a whin deer. Okay, and then he compared these two words, windier, more windy, and windier, this kind of animal, and asked native speakers to hear which was which. He did tape splicing and whatnot, so that he put in a win instead of the rain on reindeer. And that's where listeners were unable reliably to hear the difference. So that supports the view that it's the same thing. On the other hand, the compression possibilities clearly apply only here and not to the dear, near words. You can't say yeah instead of near, but you can say lenient instead of lenient. Further, very interesting evidence comes from the treatment of foreign languages. Now, Spanish also has a compression rule, but the rules are different. The rule is different, the environment is different. In Spanish, you can always compress an unstressed I or U vowel before a following vowel. So, in Spanish, there is a word, well, you can think of it as basically siesta, but because the Spanish rule obligatorily compresses, here you get siesta as the actual pronunciation, and it actually has two syllables. Okay, we borrowed this word into English, but the English compression rule is different. English compression says, no, you can't compress before a strong vowel N. So in English, this word has three syllables. To have a siesta, siesta, siesta is three syllables in English. And so is fiesta, by the way, exactly in parallel. Compression also operates across word boundaries in English. We saw that words like me and to have a weak form, which involves switching to the happy vowel, the thank you vowel. So not tell me usually, but tell me. And if we're following this with another vowel, as in tell me a story, and that following vowel is a weak vowel, as the article a story, lo and behold, the conditions for compression are met. And as you would therefore predict, we can compress. And we can say, tell me a story. Tell me a story. That's quite normal in connected speech. Tell me a story. But tell me everything. We can't compress, because ev is then strong. You can't say tell me everything. But we can say tell me a story. Tell me a story. The train is about to arrive. Okay, about to arrive. Weak vowel, so we can compress about to arrive. But I'm going to eat. Can you say I'm going to eat? Well, not really. Well, it means something different. It means I'm making the noise that a bird makes, tweeting. Because eat, E is a strong vowel, and you can't compress before it. So there seems to be a real systematicity about this. We have a rule, and we follow it. Here's another one involving a syllabic consonant. The word and, out and about. To go out and about is an idiomatic phrase, and well, we can compress, we can say to go out and about, out and about, out and about, out and about. Can lose its syllabicity because the following is weak. More examples in connected speech. A couple of minutes, couple ends in a syllabic L, but because it's followed by a schwa in the weak form of, you can compress a couple of minutes. If you were to use a strong form and say a couple of minutes, well, it would be odd anyhow, but you furthermore couldn't compress before it. We can get whole chains of derivation like this if you've got a neighbour of ours. Neighbour, you can get a linking R there before the following schwa. Neighbour of ours. Schwa plus R in neighbour can give you a syllabic R by syllabic consonant formation. Neighbour of ours. Syllabic R can then lose its syllabicity because it's a weak vowel following, so compression to neighbour of ours. So, in order to understand the kinds of things that you get in dictations, when we give you phonetic dictation of English, a neighbour of ours, you've got to understand the regularities lying behind all of these rules of connected speech. Now, compression is something that's clearly been in English for many, many years, and indeed is shared with very minor differences in all the Germanic languages. And this means that certain words that historically had more syllables may nowadays in practice have fewer syllables. And it's therefore difficult to know in dictionaries and so on what to give as the first entry or as the main entry. The word every, for example, is really always pronounced just as two syllables, every. A possible uncompressed every sounds extremely artificial and is not in practice used. Though you will in song lyrics sometimes see EV apostrophe RY to sort of remind you of this. Historically it was once every. What about several? Well, for me several is in the same category as every. I really don't think I ever normally say several. It's not part of my repertoire. I can do it as an example, but I wouldn't otherwise. And yet there are some pronunciation dictionaries. This screen comes from my comparison of various different dictionaries. Some dictionaries that give it with the form several as the basic form. I don't. I think it ought to be given as several because that's how it's really always pronounced. But there's clearly a matter for judgment here. What do we do about different? I think I always compress different, though here obviously it derives from differ, so we in a sense know that it's differ plus unt different. But I would have thought that it's rare enough to hear different that we should always say different. Introspecting myself, I reckon I always compress general. I don't ever say general. I always say generally, not generally. I think I always say reference, not reference, but I know other people say that. I think I always say factory, not factory. I always put new batteries in, not new batteries in. And indeed I speak of history, where many people do speak of history. So this may be something that varies from speaker to speaker, but there's a good case for treating all of these as categorically compressed. Others are trickier. Is it victory? Even though many of us always say victory. Phonetic term, is it lateral? You hear Americans say lateral, but I think I would say lateral. You hear the affricate there that results from loss of the schwa through compression. Camera, not camera for me. Federal, again you hear Americans say federal. Americans don't seem to go in for compression quite as much as we do. Bothering. Sometimes you can see there's a reason for not compressing. The name of the country, Hungary, is a case in point. Because if you compress it, it results in hungry, which means something else. All right, now, the last process we want to look at is smoothing. How do we pronounce the word on the left? Well, basically you might think of it as fire. What do I normally say in real life? Fire. So what's going on here? Well, we have two things happening, of which the first one affects the diphthong, the I diphthong. If this is phi with an after it, fire, what happens is the I loses its second element. So instead of being I, it's just a. You can hear this in words like triangle, which I usually say as triangle. Can you hear how the E has gone? Instead of triangle, I'm saying triangle. You may think this is very sloppy, and not something you want to encourage, but it's a fact of life. Likewise in power. What do I usually say? I call this thing a power station. Why? Because the ow is susceptible to losing its U element, its second element. Instead of ow, we just have a. So power can become power. Now, here's a kind of logical diagram of how I see this. I start out with two syllables in fire. First syllable has a diphthong, second syllable has a schwa. And we have two processes which we could optionally apply to this sequence. Going across, we have smoothing, which means we lose the non-syllabic I bit. And that gives us a two-syllable pronunciation, fa. Vertically, we have a different process. Vertically, we have compression. Compression changing two syllables into one. So if we then smooth, I don't want updates, go away. If we then compress the unsmoothed aya, we get a single syllable, fire. If we compress the smoothed ah, we get a single syllable, ah, fa, fa. And the problem is that historically, it's really the compressed, not smooth thing that is our starting point once the R was lost. And this would give you a true triphthong, that is, three vowel qualities all in one syllable, fire. And Peter Roach, for example, in his English Phonetics and Phonology, has a whole section devoted to the English triphthongs. You notice that in my works, I don't speak of English as having triphthongs. I see no place for them. Because I believe, quite honestly, that it's very rare to get a phonetic true triphthong in English. It seems to me that if you put everything present and say fire, you're more or less saying it as two syllables, not compressing it. If, on the other hand, you say it as one syllable, fire station, fire brigade, as I usually do, then that necessarily involves smoothing as well. losing the I element from it. Now, I could be wrong about this, but that's my take on what's going on here. So, I would regard the usual things as being either non-compressed, slow, not smooth, fire, or faster compressed, smooth, fire. From the point of view of the foreign learner, you can just ignore all of this and treat the basic fire as the normal thing. But there's one warning if you do this, that you must train people in auditory comprehension so that they can understand the smoothed and compressed versions. Otherwise, when you say, now tell me, how do I get to University College London? Where is it? And you get the answer, it's in Gower Street. You have to be able to interpret that Ga means Gawa. And if you ask, which faculty is the Department of Phonetics and Linguistics in? And you get the answer, oh, we're in life sciences. You've got to know that sciences means sciences. Ah. So you've got to be able to interpret these smooth and compressed forms, even if you can't do them yourself. Well, those are more examples of that, but it's on the handout, and I think we've come to the end. Thank you very much.